Good morning. Thank you all for coming. So our question this morning is, why are we at the 26th COP, nearly 3 decades after the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, still without an adequate treaty to prevent dangerous climate change, as every country on Earth agreed in 1992? So welcome colleagues here in person to and those on the interweb and those watching on tape. We have an amazing panel, and we're going to do this hybrid. I want to thank our staff here, Dana, Helma, and others in the back in the booth. They've been amazing. I think this is one of the first sessions ever, maybe, actually, Jen, you probably know better than I, about climate obstruction at the UN negotiations. Which surprises me, that this is really a key part of what happens here, and it's almost never discussed. And you found your way here to the WWF Panda Hub, which, like the Loch Ness Monster, disappeared for a while underwater, and then it reappeared. I guess it was the U.S. Climate Action Center for a while. Thank you. So my name's Timmons Roberts. I'm at Brown University. I'm a professor of environment and society, and I direct the Climate and Development Lab there. And also I'm the executive director of the Climate Social Science Network, which is the sponsor of this session. The Climate Social Science Network is, I think we could go to those slides. I just have a few screen captures from our website. We're just a year old. We now have already over 200 scholars, social scientists in over 25 countries, and we're growing. What we do is we provide them with the 3 C's. That is, let me see if I can do this. This is my Climate and Development Lab. I want to acknowledge them. They're an awesome group of young scholars at Brown University. This is our opening webpage. We provide the 3 C's to social scientists: community, collaboration, and communications. So we have 8 working groups. These are they, and the number is growing as they're sort of self-organizing. They vary from issues such as greenwashing, media, global census of climate obstruction organizations, the role of extractive industries in developing countries' positions in the climate change negotiations, and more broadly on their national, their domestic climate policy. These are interdisciplinary, they're international collaboratives, they're producing position papers, research agendas, review articles, and original team research. There's lots more material on our website. It's just cssn.org, including our policy briefings and so on. I want to acknowledge our funders. We've been able to do this because of the amazing support of the High Tide Foundation. The founder is here, Dee Lawrence. Thank you so much for coming and for this funding. It's extraordinary what we've been able to do, and we're looking forward to 2 more years and seeing how it grows and what we do. I want to draw your attention to one of our primers. It's not in this is the kind of stuff you see on the front page, but it's called the Structure of Climate Obstruction. And it identifies sort of the major actors that are blocking climate action. It's about the United States, but it's also, I think, about the world now. And what it shows is that there are flows of money from individuals, foundations, and corporations who fund advocacy organizations, advertising agencies, trade associations, think tanks, lobbying firms, media outlets that are, specifically, especially the right-wing ones that attack climate action, political action committees, they fund campaigns, they fund university programs, and of course K-12 programs as well, primary, secondary education. And these in turn all seek to influence the public and political agendas to get their way in our public policy. That is, in this case, positions going into the COP and the actions taken during the COPs. So I think we can take this screen down and go back to our original slide. Do I need to do that? I think I can do that. I'm going to leave the speakers up here. So we have 6 amazing panelists. 4 are in the room, 2 are remote. We're still waiting for Salim ul Hook from the International Center for Climate Change and Development in Bangladesh. But given how late I saw him here last night, I'm not surprised that he's going to come in at the last minute. So we have Dr. Jen Allen, who's down here, a lecturer at Cardiff University. Her work focuses on the history of the UNFCCC negotiations and activism, including in her recent book, The New Climate Activism. Jenny Stevens is the director of Northeastern University's School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs, Dean's Professor of Sustainability Science and Policy, and the author of the recent book, Diversifying Power, Why We Need Anti-Racist Feminist Leadership on Climate and Energy. She's trained in environmental science and engineering at Harvard and Caltech. Doreen Stabinsky is a professor of global environmental politics at College of the Atlantic in Bar Harbor, Maine, located in the traditional homelands of the Penobscot and Passamaquoddy nations of the Wakanaabe Confederacy. She lectures widely on issues related to land and climate change, and the author of the recent report, Chasing Carbon Unicorns on Carbon Markets and Net Zero. Ruth McKee is online. She's remote. Maybe we could pull up our remote people on one of the screens if we can do that. She's senior lecturer in criminology at De Montfort University, Leicester, UK. Her research focus is on the historic role of climate obstruction in delaying climate action, with a key focus on the historical, political, and economic context. And she has additional work on rural resistance and responses to flooding and communities post-environmental disaster. Also remote is Peter Newell, who's a professor of international relations at the University of Sussex in the UK. More than 25 years now, he's conducted research, consultancy, and advisory work on issues of climate change and energy, carbon markets, agricultural biotech, corporate accountability, and trade policy. And he's worked in Argentina, Brazil, China, Ethiopia, India, Kenya, Mexico, and South Africa. So I'm going to get us started. I guess I could also say Salim ul Hook directs that ICAD Center in Bangladesh. He's been working on adaptation to climate change in the most vulnerable countries. He's an advisor to the Least Developed Countries Group on the topic, especially on loss and damage. And he's been to every single COP since the beginning. I think if you pin him down, he'll say he missed 5 bis, which was that weird one where they had to have an additional COP. But he's been at every other one. So I want to get us started, and I guess we'll start with Jen and then Jenny and Doreen to get us going. So I've sort of bundled the first two questions here. What obstruction have we seen at the negotiations, and how do we know that? And then what's visible at the COP, or what's occurring back home? I mean, where is the important obstruction happening, and how do we know?
It's a really tricky question. Uh-oh. Oh, yeah, there we go. Sorry. I think it's really tricky to see at COP. So I think a lot of the, especially lobbying on the behalf of corporations, happens at home, because that's where the positions are set. That's where the various ministries have to collaborate to set their positions across all the issue areas here. Because when we think of COP, we think of reducing emissions and mitigation, but there's an awful lot of things at COP. There's finance, and I think especially on the finance angle is where we're seeing a lot of obstruction happening. And Doreen will probably speak to loss and damage later, where I think a similar case. So I think we see a lot of it at home to set those positions. It doesn't mean that companies are quiet at COP by any means, but the main sort of route that they have is before countries even get here, to set sort of the discourse back home, and then to set the positions, or to help set the positions. One way to see this at COP is potentially to look at who negotiators are, because in a few cases we have had negotiators who, for example, represent consultancies or represent companies that do carbon trading, and then they're actually at the table helping to negotiate rules. So that might be one way to see it. Personally, I'm following the negotiations a bit too closely, probably. And so I'm seeing a lot of procedural delays happening. So maybe we establish a work program in the future. And some of them are very principled. You know, there's a principle behind the procedure. But I think that's kind of where we're seeing a lot of the obstruction show up in the negotiations, is let's set up a plan to talk about a plan kind of thing. But I'm sure Jenny probably has others.
Yeah, I just want to say there's a nice Gene Chemick article in E&E News about, for example, the some of the negotiators for Saudi Arabia are actually employees of Saudi Aramco, or from their state-owned oil company, and the tactic of delay is the huge one, right? Jenny?
Yeah, so I guess I would frame it differently in that it is blatantly obvious here at COP that we are seeing, what I frame as a leadership crisis and complete disempowerment of so many people who are not here, and the corporate interests dominating, including influencing so many of the governments and the positions. So I study in my work problematic power dynamics related to climate and energy, climate justice and energy justice, and really have a much broader view, and encourage us all to really be thinking about the depth of cultural, political, and economic influence of this decades-long strategic investment by the polluter elite, fossil fuel industry, other corporate entities that are not only been investing in denying climate science and confusing us about the severity, but also very strategically investing in a mistrust of government, which disempowers us and our democracies, and also disempowering and minimizing workers' rights and workers' protections, and it's all part of a strategic effort to continue this kind of patriarchal leadership that concentrates wealth and power by intentionally excluding people, and really trying to continue to focus on technological innovation, not social innovation, continuing to think about climate in isolation of other issues rather than linking climate together with other policy issues, and continuing to focus on demand side, and then blaming people for the choices that we make rather than focusing on supply side. We should be talking about fossil fuel production and regulating fossil fuel production. Fossil fuels looks like is mentioned in the draft so far, but only coal is talked about phasing out, not oil and gas. So we have to hold people accountable and move away from the extractive, exploitative systems that are being perpetuated here, and I think talking about fossil fuel production seems to be a big priority. Yeah.
Thanks, Jenny. Doreen?
Yeah, let me follow up on fossil fuels. I mean, evidence of obstruction over the last, even the framing of the UNFCCC has allowed us to not talk about fossil fuels for 25 COPs, and now fossil fuels is in the draft. It's not going to stay, but nice try to actually put some calling out of fossil fuel subsidies. I would add, in terms of the delay and the obstruction, and denial. And I just saw this headline this morning. Laurence Tubiana was one of the architects of the Paris Agreement. Came out with an article that the headline was.
Point that in a little more. That's better, I think.
I have no idea how to work these things.
Is that better?
That's okay.
Yeah.
The headline was "Greenwashing is the new climate denial," and I think net zero is the new climate denial, right? And net zero as the way to greenwash image, the way to greenwash action, because net zero is actually about not acting. And net zero is about delaying into the future. And net zero is not talking about the real need, which is the phase out of fossil fuels. It's saying that, well, we don't really have to get to zero. We just have to come up with a lot of nature in order to balance out our continuing fossil emissions. And so I think that's what I would add. That's sort of, net zero is the frame of this entire meeting. The UK government has been very clear about wanting to have an outcome on net zero at the same time that they're planning to drill in the North Sea with Cambo, at the same time where they're planning a new coal mine in Cambria, or Cumbria. Somewhere in the UK, Cumbria? Yeah. All at the same time, wearing the cloak of net zero. That I think is, right on Laurence Toubiana, that's the new climate denial. It's not happening. We can just carry on with business as usual. Net zero will take care of everything.
Talking about the hopes for carbon capture out in the future as well, to make these net zero plans happen. So now I'd like to turn to our people online. So I think we'll start with Peter. Peter, you want to take a swing?
Sure. I mean, I would echo really what's been said already. This is not a new story. Right from the very outset, as Doreen was saying, there's been lobbyists. In fact, my first COP, I haven't been to as many as Salim, but COP2 was the first one I went to. And at that time, it was groups like the Global Climate Coalition and the Climate Council. And the way they worked was often trying to work with some of the obstructionist states, largely OPEC states, drafting text, trying to slow things down. And the focus then was very much on the science, right? It was pushing back on the idea that there was any scientific basis for action, and that was their key target. But clearly that's moved on. They've largely lost that fight, I think, not in all quarters, but the shift has now moved on to things like the economics of tackling the problem and the costs of net zero actions. And as others have already said, the big push is around techno fixes of one sort or another, or around net zero, without any real sense of whose land, whose forests will be set aside in order to absorb the emissions associated with increased extraction. So Shell alone, right, their plans for extraction, any way they can do that is to set aside a land the size of Honduras, right? And if you take the top 4 oil companies, they're assuming a land mass twice the size of the UK will be set aside in order to allow them to expand fossil fuel production. Now, whether people have been consulted who happen to live on that land or in those forests about whether they're willing to do that in order to allow major oil companies to expand fossil fuel frontiers and further fuel climate crisis, I very much doubt. So what we're seeing, I think, is this shifting strategy, and we're seeing it in the UK here too. So something called the Global Warming Policy Foundation, which some people may have heard of, was an outright climate skeptic organization, but they've now rebranded themselves as Net Zero Watch. And what they do is try and push out people who are in the front line of energy transitions, workers who are suffering from higher energy prices or rising costs, to try and pour doubt on the economic case for action. So there's clearly been a shift. So I guess to sum up, I'd say the obstructionism is still there. It's evolved and it's taking different forms. But for all the reasons outlined, it's very much there. And again, I would, echoing Doreen, I'd be surprised if the language on fossil fuels stays in there, because there's been a concerted effort to keep it out of the negotiations all the way through.
That's quite helpful. Thanks, Peter. Ruth, you want to take a swing?
Yeah, I just want to echo what everybody else has covered so far in terms of at-home obstruction and obstruction activities. But I also want to add to that in a couple of places. One thing that's really poignant to me in some of the work that I've been thinking about when it comes to obstruction is this human-centered focus on the entire discussion. And when you have this human-centered focus, you don't put nature in place. So it links with nature-based solutions. It's nature-based solutions for human consumption. It's nature-based solutions to keep humans doing okay. And the types of conversations, those focused on economics in the COP, as we've gone through the past 2 weeks, really sort of cement that we aren't necessarily thinking about the environment from outside of our human lens. And that's, then we think of extinction, and we think of the calls for extinction and what could happen if we don't hit our target. And that, again, focuses on humans. And the conversations throughout COP, for me, really just center on a human-focused lens rather than a complete eco lens, I guess. And this is also important, I think, for when we're thinking about the military and carbon emissions from the military. And we know that these types of carbon emissions are quite unknown, hidden from the mainstream, and are sort of not really a conversation, but there was a conversation and a speech made by Nancy Pelosi yesterday I think it was, regarding military and the focus on human security. And so the impacts of climate change on human security, i.e. we need to keep on supporting a military budget, less attention and focus on emissions. They need the fuel to support these security issues. And to me, that sort of, again, highlights a very human-focused issue around emissions cuts, i.e. not addressing emissions from a particular sector. And I think that is a conversation that we haven't necessarily covered enough in these negotiations, and the implications of military and emissions from military. And I think it's an avoidance, and it is an obstruction activity in and of itself.
Ruth, I think that's a very interesting point that has almost never been talked about in here. So I wanted to turn to a next round of questions, which is about, let's start with what discourses of climate delay are we hearing here? So there was an article that came out about 1.5 years ago, led by William Lamb, and I was on that with a bunch of others, which laid out a typology of discourses of climate delay. So there were 4 types: redirecting responsibility, which included whataboutism, which says, well, what about China? Mostly is the most famous, most used one. Or it's often used by small countries, or by almost everybody can wheel it out and say, well, what about this other country that's not acting? I shouldn't act until they do. Individualism, that I think Jenny mentioned, pointing that the individuals are the ultimately responsible. Free rider excuse, that, well, somebody else is going to free ride, and that'll put my country at a disadvantage. So those are examples of redirecting responsibility. Another one is pushing non-transformative solutions. So that would include technological optimism, that some technology out in the future is going to solve the problem. All talk and little action, that where the world leaders are addressing this, and we have this great goal out in the future. Fossil fuels are key to the solution. And then there's no sticks, just carrots. That is really a sort of visceral avoidance of regulation, and instead expecting voluntary initiatives to take care of the problem. So there's 2 more, sorry. The third category is emphasizing the downsides. So policy perfectionism is one way to emphasize the downside, that we should not act on this. We should not adopt this carbon tax because it fails, because it misses this or that. Come on up, Salim. The appeal to social justice, that is, this policy is going to hurt poor people or people in developing countries, and so therefore we should not act in this way on climate change. And then the appeal to well-being, that in general people are going to suffer. So that's the third category, emphasizing the downsides. And finally, surrender. That is, it's too late. Doomism. We should not act because, why? We're going down anyway. And then the other is just that change is impossible or extremely unlikely. So I'm going to run down the table, and we'll get back to you in a moment, Salim. Welcome. Thanks for coming. And I wanted to have you all reflect on which of these, or are there different discourses of climate delay that you're hearing at the negotiations or in the lead up to the negotiations in the national capitals? Because I think this article, even just 1.5 years old, is already out of date, because there are new ones being invented all the time. Especially, and I think, one of the points that we're learning in the Climate Social Science Network, especially my group at Brown University, and Robert Brule is leading this, is that the public relations industry is really the core coordinating mechanism of climate obstruction, and the public, because they are often creating the grassroots organizations, or what they call astroturf groups, which look like they're grassroots. They are developing public relations, advertising campaigns. They're developing very complex influence campaigns. So Jen, do you want to start us off on this question of
Sure. I'll probably have a few interrelated points. One is absolutely the whataboutism. And we saw this before Paris, that especially developed countries used their very large media presence and their access to media to put a lot of stories about the emissions profiles of China and India and what they weren't doing to help realize an ambitious Paris Agreement. And then we saw the exact same thing before this COP, where it was all about where's China's NDC, where's India's new NDC, where's their net zero plan, is 2070 good enough? There wasn't anything as much about where's New Zealand's, or Australia's isn't very good. It was all about, well, how come President Xi isn't here? And so the disproportionate attention put on some countries also links into a lot of conversations about colonial mindsets and who's responsible historically. It also really matters that when China puts forward a pledge, they're not putting forward something that they aren't sure they can't meet. So they wouldn't put in an NDC that they were not sure that they could achieve. And maybe contrast that to some of the developed countries' NDCs and goals that we're seeing. They're not 100% sure they can hit those targets. Canada might have a chance, but there's a lot of ifs in the Canadian context. So our NDC might look ambitious on paper, but if there isn't a plan to actually meet it, is that a useful NDC versus China's, where they have a plan to meet those targets? So maybe they didn't do a massive update here, but we know they're going to hit them, and they're confident they're going to hit them. And that wasn't in the conversation. So I think that's a whataboutism that's missing, to look at sort of what are the power dynamics behind continually pointing at certain countries. The other one I think that we just talked about a bit was a long-termism. So in the cover decisions, there's calls for hitting 1.5 by 2100, because apparently that's what the IPCC says, except they don't. IPCC says we can hit 1.5 by 2100 if there's something called overshoot, which means we exceed 1.5 and then we come back down. The trick there is you don't know when you start coming back down until after the fact. So in that case, if we're going to say 1.5 by 2100, we won't know until about 2100. So that's COP 120 something that we'll be able to celebrate. Versus staying on an emissions reduction scenario that's not relying on mid-century and later net zero, then we know if we're making progress all the way through versus going up and then coming back down. So we're seeing we're seeing net zero plans into the future without NDCs that are going to hit those plans. So we don't have the short-term step to meet the long-term goal. And we're seeing goals reformulated so that it's more like 2100, we might be seeing all of these effects. And then just quickly, because I know I'm rambling, we're also talking about mitigation here a lot, and I know probably Salim will talk about this, but some of it is also, what about ambition on adaptation, loss and damage, providing finance? And when we're not doing those things, we're already crippling climate action, because it is a global effort. And so when we see obstruction in the finance rooms, when we see obstruction on the adaptation front, then we're also looking at, especially if we're going to start talking about overshoot, condemning an awful lot of people to a pretty miserable life. And so when you look at who's not providing that finance, or what private companies aren't mobilizing finance, or maybe even getting a high-level statement here, like Bezos was here last week, he could cough up enough money or find it in his sofa cushions to help fund adaptation, right? But he's getting a high level, he was on the big stage. So there's a bit of a legitimacy issue here for the UN. That's part of this long-termism, who are we inviting, and who are we letting stay silent and not contribute to the global effort? And that's thinking sort of holistically about it.
Thank you, Jen. Excellent points. Jenny?
So I would say that we're probably seeing all of those narratives, except maybe the doomism, right? Because everybody here, there's a very can-do attitude. So much, this techno-optimism that you mentioned. And I think what's really important is also the narratives that we're hearing in the halls, not in the negotiating space, but from so many of the different civil society constituents. And I'm part of the Women and Gender constituency. You may have seen people wearing feminist climate justice masks. There's a different color for each day. Today is pink, and the pink represents today's theme of intersectional feminist climate action. None of us are free until all of us are free. So kind of acknowledging the systems of oppression that are being perpetuated with a lot of the solutions that are being put forth. And I think it's really important to acknowledge, again, whose voices and what narratives are not being given the voice and the stage. And there's quite a lot of sense that there's some, to use the phrase, greenwashing, but then gender washing or youth washing, giving indigenous voices, giving some voice, but then not integrating those priorities into the negotiations and the agreements. And so I think, we have an opportunity, and when you think and look at all the civil society and social justice advocacy that's going on, we have an opportunity with the climate crisis to resist and restructure and reclaim and focus. Just wait a minute.
Stand by, anybody in TV land.
I mean, if we think about and acknowledge the intersecting crises, right? Economic injustices, health injustices and disparities and inequities, housing crisis, all kinds of structural racism. And what we can see from social justice advocates is that the climate crisis creates an urgency that we can actually, by linking these problems together and taking an energy democracy lens, really about redistributing power, literally and figuratively, through phase out of fossil fuels to a more renewable-based, healthy, prosperous society, we have this bigger opportunity for change. And that narrative is not mainstream here, although a lot of the civil society groups are speaking up on that. So,
thank you, Jenny. Doreen?
Yeah, so your question on discourses of delay, and if there's anything new here, and I would say net zero's new, but also it fits into many of your categories, right? So this redirecting of responsibility, yes, I'd agree with what Jen had to say. I mean, the US, the EU, the UK use the fact of, they've got some grand net zero scheme, but actually, and then pointing the finger at other countries that don't have a wonderfully packaged net zero plan. But that's actually, their net zero plans are obscuring their continued production, their continued growth in fossil fuel production and consumption, right? The U.S. is planning an increase in gas and an increase in oil. Only coal will drop in terms of U.S. production. So net zero as a way to redirect responsibility, to hide their ongoing production of fossil fuels and redirect the blame to others. I think net zero also redirects responsibility onto nature, right? And onto the natural world to sort of soak up all of those emissions. And I think that that's a new thing. We're all very happy. I'm just sort of looking at this phrase over here, accelerate deep decarbonization and invest in nature. Nature becomes a really important place to deflect responsibility onto. Everything's gonna be fine, we'll keep emitting, nature's just gonna soak it all up. And that links with this category that you had created, that you set out of pushing non-transformative solutions, right? Because if all we're doing is offsetting, if we're continuing to produce fossil fuels, continuing to emit, paying to say, keep some forests in the ground, all of that money that's paying to keep forests in the ground is money that's not being invested in transformation. So Mark Carney, the Task Force on Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets, the voluntary carbon market folks are really excited. They think that there's going to be a $100 billion offset market by the end of 2030 because net zero creates that demand for those offsets. Well, think about that. That's $100 billion a year that's not being invested in transformation. That's $100 billion a year that's just being invested in keeping forests and keeping forests standing, which is absolutely important, but we have to do both, right? We have to accelerate deep decarbonization and invest in nature, and that sort of the delay and the denial is like, well, we'll just invest in nature, and somehow that's going to take care of us.
Thanks. Salim, we're getting to you, but first Peter and Ruth. So Peter, you want to take a swing?
Yeah, let me just pick up on two of the discourses you mentioned. So one is around the appeal to justice. And while I was in Glasgow, I got back on Thursday, I went to several panels on just transitions, which of course is intrinsically important. But what I've noticed is a co-option of that language and an abuse of it, in my terms, by fossil fuel interests.
All the technology was working. It had to happen.
Just transition plan, we can't have any progress. And so just to give you a sort of concrete example, I was attending the Bonn intersessional negotiations a couple of years back, and there was a panel with various European delegations, trade union leaders, all talking about just transition. But it was in the absence of a discussion about the reserves that have to stay in the ground, right? There was no sense of this being a bounded or limited conversation. It was just about involving more and more stakeholders, clearly as a strategy of delay, right? So that's my slight concern when they talk about just transition. They're really only talking about the procedural part, and it's not something they ever demand when they relocate their operations in other sectors, right? But when we demand ambitious climate action, suddenly we have to deal with all of these social and economic and other inequalities. Which clearly we do in other fora, but they're clearly using it as a strategy of delay. So that's one. The second one, the individualization of responsibility. So we did some work early this year as part of the Cambridge Commission on scaling behavior change. And it's no mistake that some of the emphasis on individualization of responsibility comes from the fossil fuel companies themselves, right? The whole notion of carbon footprinting came from BP. So they were asking, what are you doing about climate change? And of course, many people ask back to them, what are you doing about climate change, other than trying to extract ever more oil? So it's clearly about individual change. There is a lot we can all do, but it clearly has to be linked to system change, the bigger structures that Jenny and others have been talking about. And so we do need to push back on really hammering home on what individuals and households are doing in the absence of a serious conversation also about how infrastructures and broader systems are changing at the same time.
Thanks. It's great. Ruth?
I think I just want to add to that, both echo what everyone said so far, but to also just pick up on a couple of issues around fossil fuel solutionism. So we seem to have this general focus, especially coming from the UK government around net zero, net zero, net zero, net zero. But you do have those conversations about fossil fuels are still the solution. So this is in particular coming from OPEC countries in particular, and this argument of we don't want to bias towards particular energy sources. And it sort of shifts, it's this idea that fossil fuels are not necessarily as bad, that they can be part of the same solutions as renewables, but it's still that focus that sort of contradicts that net zero element. But you also have to take in mind that that discourse of delay, in essence, is going back to some of the structures of obstruction and behind that. So fossil fuel intensive countries that rely on fossil fuels to stimulate their economies and current modes of production, like OPEC countries. And obviously OPEC countries help manage the fossil fuel market and the commodity chains that we have across, well, throughout the world. So I think on the surface, we've got the net zero as a delaying discourse, and around that you've got the delaying discourse connected to that. But I also think we can't distract from the fact that there is that fossil fuel solutionism, both as a support and in part of the solutions to climate change. Yet this is despite, in the draft agreement that's been created, that call out to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. But that narrative is still being pushed, and it's something to watch out for.
Thank you, Ruth. Jen, could you hand the mic over to Salim? So Salim, I would like to ask you this question of what discourses of delay are we hearing this year? But I would like also, because we missed you in the first round, if you could talk about what obstruction have we seen in the negotiations? How do we know that? And is it happening here, or is it happening back home in national capitals?
Thank you very much, Tim. So let me first share a few thoughts from my side on discourses in general and whose discourses matter. All right? In my view, the American discourse is a bubble, completely disconnected from the rest of the world. Your media, your audiences, your television channels have a completely different take on this problem from the rest of the world. And then in the rest of the world, there are two subcategories. There are the developed countries in Europe, Japan, New Zealand, and others who get it, for whom climate change is serious. It's about how do we tackle it, what's the best way to tackle it. And then there's the global south. In the global south, it's happening. It's already arrived. We are suffering the impacts. All this talk about emission reduction is just blah, blah, blah. Literally, blah, blah, blah. Because the impacts are happening right now as we speak, and we are the ones suffering. My compatriots in Bangladesh are suffering. That's climate change. That's the story of climate change. And the discourse there is, this is not fair. This is a problem created by rich people in rich countries, and we poor people in poor countries are suffering the consequence of that. That is completely unjust. So, you know, the people who talk about climate justice and talk about just transition, to me, just transition is a dead end. What about the injustice of the polluters affecting the victims? It's happening now, as we speak. And to us, that's the narrative we have come here to bring forward, and nobody's listening. And I'll give you a very good example that happened in the last 12 hours. So as the draft text came out, the vulnerable countries under the Climate Vulnerable Forum, currently chaired by Bangladesh, together with the youth groups, together with the indigenous groups, booked a press conference slot in the press conference venue at 6:30 p.m. Officially asked for a slot. The UNFCCC gave them a slot. It was 6:30 p.m. I was supposed to be one of the speakers. I was headed off there about 6:15, and I got a message saying, we've been bumped. Our slot is now 7:30, and the US-China have got the 6:30 slot. All right, out of the blue, US-China deal, you know, bullshit deal as far as I'm concerned. But US-China just sucked all the oxygen out of whatever we were going to say, including the UNFCCC giving them our press conference slot and bumping us to a later slot. That's the negotiation that we are in right now.
Salim, while I have you, thank you. Could you talk about sort of how the obstruction has changed over the many COPs you've been to?
It changes by issues that get raised at various times, all right? And there are certain countries that have certain positions, but then they also change and re-coalesce in different groupings. So I'll give you one example. When we started, the non-Annex 1 countries who negotiate as a group of G77 in China, which is actually 138 countries, are one big block. They were for many, many years. They're not anymore. They are the big ones, the China, India, Brazil, the BRICS. They have their own group. Then there is a whole bunch of smaller groups, one of which my country, Bangladesh, is part of, the least developed countries group, small island states group. So these different groups have different positions at different times. Sometimes they coalesce, sometimes they come together. And so it's always a dance, different partners with different groups. But the one consistent thread through all of this is the fossil fuel companies, strategies with governments who are their spokespeople. All right? There are certain governments who just simply follow whatever the fossil fuel companies tell them to do. And you couldn't have got a better example in the last 4 years of the United States when Mr. Trump just simply said whatever the coal industry told him to say. He had no idea in his own mind of what the hell he was talking about. All right? He just mouthed words that were put in his mouth. And that was the fossil fuel industry. Right now, the Prime Minister of Australia is doing the same. And the Saudis always do that because they have a very long history of doing this and very skilled at doing this. They don't do it vocally and you don't notice them. But they are by far the most effective negotiating group in the entire UNFCCC process and have been ever since we started. And their strategy is obstruction. They'll take everything out of the decision in Glasgow, I can tell you that. They always do.
I was just reading this story, a report on this Oxford study that found that Saudi Arabia spends the most microphone time in the negotiations of any country, any delegation. It's an effective delay strategy.
Absolutely, and they act as a spider with a web, all right? So there's Saudi Arabia, one country. Then there's the 8 Arab OPEC countries in the Gulf. That group is again led by Saudi Arabia. And then there's the broader OPEC set of countries, which has countries like Venezuela and Indonesia and Nigeria. And a very interesting way that they operate is that every year or every 2 years, the G77 China has a chair that rotates between continents. And developing countries, most of them don't have the capacity to chair G77. Nobody volunteers to be the next chair. What the Saudis do is they go to the OPEC member in each continent and say, you volunteer to chair G77 and we will resource you. They have a full-fledged secretariat in Vienna, in the OPEC headquarters that just does nothing but climate change. Nothing but climate change negotiations. And so when it's South America's turn, Venezuela. When it's Asia's turn, you get Indonesia. When it's Africa's turn, you get Nigeria. They capture being the spokesperson for G77 in China.
So this is because our time is going to run out quite soon. I want to keep you going, Salim, and we'll maybe go backwards through the list to talk about what should be at the top of our research agenda as social scientists to understand what's successfully obstructing these negotiations after all these 3 decades.
I guess having an in-depth understanding of how the negotiations themselves happen and how narratives are created, because the media plays a very big part in this. As we heard earlier, the narrative of COP26 in Glasgow got hijacked by it being a summit. It was never a summit, all right? It was just a whole bunch of world leaders who flew in, gave a speech, had a photograph and flew out. And then we started negotiating. Right? They didn't negotiate with anybody. They just came, had a photo op and left. And then the story became, well, Xi hasn't come. And so it's a failure. Right? It doesn't matter if Xi is here or not. The Chinese have been here from day 0. The Chinese are negotiating, as they always do. It doesn't matter whether the president flies in for a photo op or not. But that was hijacked. The entire media was shown this shiny ball of a summit and who's coming and who's not coming. And Mr. Johnson is very good at doing that, our Prime Minister in the UK. And they got distracted. He's very good at distracting the media and say, look at my shiny ball and don't look at the reality on the ground.
Thanks. I think you would have much more specific also research agendas, but we can come back to you if we have time. Jen, do you want to give it a go? Oh, I said I was going to go backwards. I'm sorry. Is that all right? Ruth, you're next.
For me, one of the key things is specifically what other options do we have other than the COP26 summit? Because if we get to grips with what's going on, and i.e. that what is not working about them, what other things can we create, or what are the other options to create an environment which is inclusive, which actually has voices heard? And the problem is that whether we like it or not, these events are there as PR events in and of themselves, where behind the curtain you have these vested interests. So do they serve the purpose of what they're doing, and what alternatives can we start to think about to basically make meaningful decisions at a global level? That would be my sort of next steps in research.
I appreciate that very much. Peter?
Yeah, for me, it's really about cleaning up politics. I think we need fossil-free politics. There's so many conflicts of interest that run through this, and Salim and others have pointed to many of them. I think we need transparency around lobbying, around revolving doors, around secondments, like proper regulation of this, not just transparency and disclosure, but restrictions on it. And let me just give you a couple of examples. Around revolving doors in the UK, 90% of those people leaving what was the Department of Energy and Climate Change took up jobs in the energy sector, right? Including 6 former energy ministers. In the US, apparently, there's over 134 members of Congress and their spouses that have nearly $93 million worth of stock in fossil fuel companies and mutual funds. Okay, and globally, the world's 5 largest publicly owned oil and gas companies spend approximately $2 million on lobbying to try and control and roll this back. So let's get those figures out there. And then, of course, there's lots of groups, you know, DSMOG and Corporate European Observatory pushing this stuff out there. But now we really need momentum around a campaign to stop it, to restrict their access to policy, because it's driving us towards climate chaos.
Thanks. I think Doreen, you're next.
Yeah, I think that there's a very rich set of questions around net zero and how is net zero being used to obstruct. And I'll just talk about a couple of things that I think are really critical questions that we need to continue to pursue with respect to net zero. One is net zero erases history and it erases responsibility, right? Because net zero is forward-looking. And this is, you know, it's very useful for those countries, in particular the United States, the EU, developed countries, who have the bulk of responsibility for climate action. And the bulk of responsibility for climate change, right? They're the ones that put that 2,400 gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere, principally. And so how net zero helps them completely reframe the question away from history and away from responsibility. And the other thing linked to that I think is really critical to point out and to show how net zero is operating and operating in and concretizing inequity in thinking about who's got access to the rest of the carbon budget, right? So the IPCC says that for an 83% chance of staying below 1.5, there's about 300 gigatons of carbon dioxide that we can continue to put into the atmosphere, right? Because carbon dioxide accumulates in the atmosphere. That is a very small budget, right? We put out about over 40 gigatons of carbon dioxide a year, so pretty much if we want to stay below 1.5, we can't put very much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And what net zero does and what offsetting does is it de facto claims that carbon space, it claims that atmospheric space for those who are continuing to emit fossil fuels, to burn fossil fuels. So on the one hand, it's an appropriation of atmospheric space, and at the same time, and I think that this needs to be dug into quite a lot more, it's an appropriation of nature, right? It's basically saying that nature exists for the elite of the world to continue flying, nature exists for the fossil fuel producers to continue to burn fossil fuels, and so there are significant equity and significant justice questions that I think researchers can can dive into around net zero, and how does net zero in and of itself, that concept, just allow the appropriation and greenwash that appropriation, right? Not just allow the appropriation, but make it look as if everybody's doing just a wonderful thing with net zero plastered all over here, and what are the real consequences there?
Thanks. There's some excellent research been taking place about how equity questions are often not included in the major indices of how countries are doing that we all refer to. You know, the Climate Action Tracker has some in there, but it's not some grandfathering, which was the way of sort of allowing the existing levels of emissions to go forward is included in some of their earlier calculations. So absolutely, this is a crucial area for a lot more research. Jenny?
So I think I would follow on and just make a larger call for investment in social innovations, right, of all kinds. Because when we focus on technological innovation, we miss the social dimensions, and we miss the social justice, and we miss the inequities and distribution issues and the vulnerabilities that Salim talked about. So I think I would, the kind of research we need is research power mapping on the problematic power dynamics and what is contributing to the increasing vulnerabilities and all the non-transformative solutions, right? We need research on the transformative solutions, right? And that includes economic research on new kinds of ownership models and new kinds of mechanisms for distributing wealth and power and political power, economic power, globally and within countries. And so there's really I think we've been, in part due to a lack of diversity and a very narrow view of who has been able to set the agenda, we've been continue to focus on science and technology, decarbonization, greenhouse gas emission reductions, and this climate isolationism perspective that we need to move away from and focus on people. What do people need? What is the people's first approach? And instead of investing in nature-based solutions, we invest in people-based solutions and think about ecosystems that include the people and justice issues.
Jen? Thanks.
Oh gosh, okay. Yes to all of these. Certainly I think mapping networks is really important. Putting people at the center is very important. And looking at the details. We see huge announcements here, but what are the words that they're actually agreeing to? Because individual words matter hugely in this process. Every comma matters in any document produced here. And sometimes those commas are there so that you can read the same sentence in multiple ways. Often, sometimes the commas are there so you can read the same sentence in multiple ways. And so thinking about those varied interpretations can tell us what's still open in climate action, and then maybe help us do some of that power mapping. I would also add to all of this, building in ways for for us to be reflective as a community about the discourses that maybe we're inadvertently buying into. I certainly, when I teach, for example, want to talk about solutions because I don't want to depress my students. So finding that balance in our research, in our outreach, in our teaching is, I think, an area as an academic community that we could look into. And also think about emerging discourses in nuanced ways, but also ways that build in that self-reflexive kind of mechanism. For example, a group of academics were talking about climate repair, because I think what they really were getting at were things like direct carbon capture. But I'm not sure if that's what they were getting at. And so it's an interesting idea, which maybe we have to talk about in a nuanced way, but maybe also we're creating a new obstructionist discourse. And so I think building in that reflexiveness as an academic community is really important.
Thanks, Jen. Could you pass the mic down to Salim for one last shot, a last thought on our research agenda? Mm-hmm.
Well, let me make a plea for collaborative global research. It's a global problem. And the research world is extremely skewed in North and South dimensions. The North has the bulk of capacity and decides what gets researched, and the South doesn't. And even in the South, I'll make a distinction between what I call the bigger South and the deep South. The bigger South are the countries that will come to your mind when you talk about the South: India, China, Brazil, South Africa, and then you'll start running out of countries that you can name. The deep South are the countries I deal with. There are 48 of them. They're called the least developed countries, most of them in sub-Saharan Africa, including my country, Bangladesh. Now, we are an order of magnitude less capacitated than India, China, Brazil. And we don't get invited to do research, collaborate with others. China, India, Brazil do. All your universities, I'm pretty sure, have collaborations in China, India, Brazil. But how many of you have collaboration in Bangladesh or in Mali or Burkina Faso? So let's collaborate.
Thank you, Salim. And we are now at our time. I just wanted to say one last thing, that international collaborative research is exactly what the Climate Social Science Network is about. Unfortunately, our membership is still very North heavy. So Salim and everybody here, if you have colleagues in the Global South, we are very much looking for representation and, of course, greater diversity in our membership and leadership. I want to thank three of our panelists are actually co-chairs of our working groups in CSSN. You can find the list of those co-chairs and how to get involved if you are a social scientist and you want to be part of this. Email me. My email is up on that screen over there. It's just timmons@brown.edu if you're interested in CSSN. Do follow up with me. We think we have an important role here, and we want to really advance the understanding of climate obstruction, because for really these 30 years, it's occurred very effectively and quietly by being poorly understood and not understood, not taken into account. It seems to me, like when something fails 30 times, you would start to learn that there's something else going on. I think there needs to be, the negotiations need to keep in mind that obstruction is here and how it functions. And the first thing is understanding how it works. So my apology to there was a question in the chat. We're sorry we couldn't get to that. I'm sorry I couldn't pass the microphone around, but we need to clear out the room so they can clean it for the next event. Thank you all so much for coming in person and watching online, and to my panelists, and to Stephanie Damasa Hansen from CSSN, who helped set this up.
I've got to run to a meeting. I would love to
Thank
be able
you
to
so much for
join you all,
coming.
but